The reading of the will. The lawyer arrived on a Tuesday, which was, in Caroline Ashford's experience, the kind of day on which news came that changed everything. Not Mondays, which carried their own oppressive weight, and not Fridays, which had the decency to let you ruin your weekend slowly. Tuesdays arrived with the cheerful indifference of a day that had no idea what it was doing to you. It was the autumn of 1858, and Hartwell Plantation in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains had been a widow's house for exactly 3 months. James Ashford, 54 years old, had died of a heart seizure in his study on a warm evening in July, leaving behind 2,400 acres of tobacco land, a mansion that needed its east wing repaired, debts he had never fully disclosed, and a wife who was discovering, day by day, that she had known her husband considerably less well than she had believed. Caroline was 41. She had been married to James for 19 years, had borne him 3 children, 2 of whom had survived infancy, and had managed the domestic operations of Hartwell with a competence that James had praised often and relied on constantly. She was a practical woman, not given to sentiment, with gray eyes that saw things clearly and hands that were never still. She had grieved her husband with appropriate dignity and then had turned to the task of understanding exactly what she had inherited. That task had proven more complicated than she anticipated. The lawyer's name was Pemberton Vane, a small, precise man from Charlottesville with ink-stained fingers and the apologetic manner of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had become his professional default. He sat across from Caroline in the front parlor, with his leather satchel on his knee and his hat on the cushion beside him, and explained, in language she had to ask him to simplify twice, that James Ashford's estate was not precisely as it appeared. "There is a codicil," he said, using the word with the caution of a man laying a trap he was required by law to set, "to the main will, added 14 months before your husband's death. I was instructed not to present it until the primary will had been read and all debts assessed." Caroline set down her teacup. "And have they been?" "They have, which is why I am here." He opened the satchel and produced a sealed envelope. The wax was dark red, bearing James's signet ring impression, the ring that Caroline had removed from his finger the morning after his death and placed in the top drawer of his desk where it remained. The seal was unbroken. "I should tell you," Pemberton Vane said, still holding the envelope, not yet offering it, "that the contents of this codicil will require decisions of some significance. I would encourage you to read it privately and to take whatever time you need before acting on it." "Give me the letter, Mr. Vane." He gave her the letter. What the codicil said, in the formal language of a document drawn up by a careful lawyer who had been paid to make the truth as palatable as legal precision allowed, was this: that James Ashford had, for the past 16 years, maintained a separate household some 40 miles to the south, near the town of Culpeper, that this household was comprised of an enslaved woman named Delia and her daughter, Iris, that Iris, currently aged 15, was James Ashford's biological child, and that James Ashford, in the final year of his life, had directed that upon his death, both Delia and Iris were to be given their freedom, that a sum of $800 was to be placed in trust for Iris's education, and that Caroline, as his widow and the primary heir to Hartwell, was to be informed of this arrangement in full. The letter was signed James Edward Ashford, in the handwriting she had been reading for 19 years. Caroline sat with the codicil in her hands for a long time after Pemberton Vane had gone. The fire in the parlor grate was burning low. The autumn light came through the tall windows in long, dusty angles, illuminating the motes in the air, turning everything amber and golden and false. She read the document 3 times. She understood every word on the first reading. The second and third were something else. The process of accepting what you have understood. James had a daughter who was 15 years old, which meant she had been conceived in the 2nd year of their marriage, in the time that Caroline had always thought of as their happiest, the year their son William was born, the year James had given her the pearl earrings she still wore on Sundays. She set the codicil on the side table and looked at the fire for a long while without inking anything that she could have put into words. The following morning, she called for her horse. Chapter 2. The House in Culpeper County. The road south was 40 miles of Virginia autumn, red oaks and sourwood trees burning against a sky so blue it seemed painted. Fields of spent tobacco left in brown rows, farmhouses set back from the road with smoke rising from their chimneys. Caroline rode most of it in silence, accompanied only by her groom, a man named Thomas who had served the Ashford household for 30 years and who understood, with the discretion of someone who had learned that the quality of his life depended on perfect discretion, that no questions were appropriate today. She had not told her son. William was 17, home from his first year at university in Richmond, still in the first phase of grief for his father, the phase in which the father remained perfect, unchanged by the knowledge of what he had actually been. She would not take that from him yet, perhaps not ever. That was a decision for later. She had told herself on the road that she was going simply to assess the situation, to understand, practically, what James had created and what it would require to resolve. She told herself this with the conviction of a woman who was accustomed to making herself believe necessary fictions. But she also knew, somewhere beneath the practicality, that she was going because she needed to see, because the abstract knowledge of what James had done was one thing, and the reality of the woman and the girl whose lives he had quietly maintained alongside his legitimate family was another. She needed to make it real. She needed to look at it directly. The house was not what she expected, which told her something she had not wanted to know. She had imagined a crude arrangement, a tenant's cabin, a place of bare minimum comfort that would have allowed James to tell himself he was being generous while spending as little as possible. Instead, the house on the edge of Culpeper County was a modest but well-kept frame building with a kitchen garden that had been carefully tended through the summer, a woodpile stacked with the precision of someone who understood winter, and roses. The roses struck her first, because James had never shown the slightest interest in flowers at Hartwell. Yet here were roses, planted along the front fence with the care of someone who had chosen each variety deliberately. They were past their season now, the hips red and heavy on the canes, but the structure of the planting spoke of years of attention. Caroline sat on her horse for a moment before dismounting, looking at the house that her husband had maintained for 16 years without her knowledge. The smoke from the chimney was thin and gray. The door was shut. She knocked. Delia answered. She was perhaps 38 years old, with a face that had known beauty and still held it in a different form, the beauty of structure and intelligence rather than youth. She looked at Caroline with eyes that showed no surprise. She had been expecting this visit, Caroline realized, probably for months, possibly for years. She had known it would come, and she had prepared herself for it. "Mrs. Ashford?" Delia said. Not a question. Yes. There was a pause in which both women looked at each other across the threshold of the house that one had built and the other had just discovered, and some silent negotiation took place, some assessment of what this encounter would be, what each of them was prepared to be to the other. "Come in," Delia said. "Iris is at her lessons. She'll be finished in an hour." "She has a tutor?" "She teaches herself. She's been doing it since she was 9. A pause. "He sent books. Every season, more books." Caroline stepped inside. The interior of the house was as carefully kept as the garden. Books on a shelf, not just primers, but histories, novels, a volume of poetry with its spine cracked from use. A piano, small but real, its keys worn smooth. On the wall, a pencil drawing of a man, James, unmistakably, rendered from memory by someone who had looked at him many times. The drawing was done with skill, the kind of skill that comes from years of practice. Caroline looked at the drawing for a moment longer than she intended. "She drew that," Delia said, from behind her, "when she was 12. She asked me what he looked like when he was young. I told her he looked the same, only lighter. She drew what I described." Caroline turned away from the drawing. "I've come about the codicil," she said, "because practical things were easier."
"I know." Delia moved to the kitchen table and sat down, folding her hands before her with a composure that Caroline recognized, the composure of someone who has spent years preparing for the worst and has arrived at the strange peace of someone who no longer fears it. "He told me about it 2 years ago, that he had written it, that he intended to honor it when the time came. He wanted us to be free. He wanted her to have a chance at education. He should have done it sooner, he knew that." "Why didn't he?" Caroline asked. The question came out more directly than she had planned. Delia looked at her steadily. "Because he was afraid of what people would say, of what you would think, of what it would cost him in the world." She paused. "The same reason most men with good intentions do nothing about them." Chapter 3. The Girl Named Iris. Iris came in from the back room an hour later, as Delia had said she would, carrying a book with her thumb marking her page. She was 15 years old, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw Caroline and looked at her with the unsettling directness of someone who has spent their whole life being looked at and has decided that they will look back. She was tall for her age, with her mother's strong bone structure and her father's gray eyes. James Ashford's gray eyes, the same gray eyes that looked at Caroline from across the breakfast table every morning for 19 years. The resemblance was not subtle. It was not the kind of thing a person could rationalize or explain away. It was simply there, sitting in the girl's face, patient and irrefutable. Caroline did not allow herself to react. She was a woman who had learned over 4 decades of life that the moments requiring the most dignity were always the ones in which dignity felt most impossible. "This is Mrs. Ashford," Delia said. "She's come about the papers." Iris looked at Caroline and then looked at her mother, and something passed between them, the silent communication of 2 people who have prepared for exactly this moment, who have discussed it in the evenings when the day's work was done and there was nothing left but the truth. "Are you going to honor them?" Iris asked. Her voice was direct, without the careful deference that most enslaved people learn to perform for safety. It was the voice of someone who had been raised deliberately and at great effort to know that she had a right to ask questions. Caroline was quiet for a moment. The gray eyes looked at her, James's eyes, in a face that was not his face, in a life he had created in secret and left for his widow to manage. "Yes," Caroline said, "I am." It was the first decision she had made since opening the codicil that she did not have to think about. It arrived fully formed, the way some decisions do, not as a choice, but as a recognition of something that was simply true. But even as she said it, she understood that honoring the codicil was only the beginning of the problem. Freedom for a woman and a girl in Virginia in 1858 was not a gift that could simply be handed over like a deed of property. Freedom in this time and place was a condition that required protection, resources, and the willingness of others to recognize it. And Virginia in 1858 was a state in which the legal status of free people of color was increasingly precarious, in which laws existed to make freedom difficult to maintain, in which the difference between a free person and an enslaved one could be reduced by the right judge with the right motivation to a question of paperwork. She had freed them on paper. Now she had to figure out what that actually meant. Chapter 4. What Caroline Found in the Desk. She returned to Hartwell that evening and went directly to James's study. It was a room she had entered only rarely during his lifetime, his space, organized according to a system that he maintained privately, that she had respected as a matter of marital courtesy, without ever examining the reasons for her own deference. Now she sat in his chair,
in the room that still smelled faintly of him, and began to understand what she had actually been courteous about. The desk was a roll-top, massive and mahogany, with more compartments and drawers than she had realized. She worked through them methodically, the way she had always approached difficult tasks, not with dread, but with the discipline of someone who believes that the worst thing is uncertainty, and that knowledge, however painful, is preferable to its absence. What she found told a story that was more complex and in some ways more painful than the Codicil had suggested. There were letters from Delia, not many, perhaps 20 over the course of 16 years, short, carefully worded, written with the restraint of someone who understood both the value and the danger of putting anything in writing. They described Iris's progress, her health, her development. They described practical needs, a repair to the roof, a replacement for a stove that had stopped drawing properly. They were not love letters. They were the letters of a woman managing a complicated situation with the tools available to her. James's responses were not there. Presumably he had not kept copies, or Delia had kept them. But the shape of the correspondence made the relationship clear enough. It was not the passionate affair of a man who had been swept away by feeling. It was something older and more troubling, the arrangement of a man who had acquired a dependency and maintained it with the dutiful regularity of someone paying a bill he didn't entirely understand how he had incurred.
There was also, tucked into the back of the lowest drawer, a second set of financial records. Not the plantation accounts she had been reviewing. She had gone through those thoroughly in the months since James's death, with the help of his overseer and a patient accountant from Charlottesville. These were separate records, kept in a small leather notebook with a clasp. They documented 16 years of payments, the house's maintenance, Delia's household expenses, the piano, the books, the tutor's fees for 2 years before Iris had apparently decided she could teach herself more efficiently. The amounts were not enormous, but they were consistent, and they were drawn from accounts that Caroline had believed were solely for plantation expenses. She sat with the notebook in her hands and felt, for the first time since opening Pemberton Van's envelope, something she had been carefully not feeling. Not grief for James, she had done that, or at least begun it. Not anger exactly, though anger was present, a low, steady heat rather than a fire. Something more complicated, the sensation of understanding, fully and finally, that the life she had believed she was living had been, in some fundamental way, not the life that was actually occurring. She had been the mistress of a household. She had been competent and trusted and necessary. She had managed the domestic operations of Hartwell with skill and had believed that her competence extended to knowing what she was competent in service of. She had not known about the other house. She had not known about the piano, or the roses, or the gray eyes that her husband had also given to a girl 40 miles south. The question was not whether she had been deceived. She had been, clearly, by a man who had possessed the skill to maintain a deception for 16 years because he was afraid of the consequences of honesty. The question was what she was going to do now. She stayed in his study until midnight, reading everything. Then she went to bed and slept without difficulty, because she had always been a person who could sleep when there was nothing more to be usefully done, and there was nothing more to be usefully done that night. She dreamed of the roses on the fence.
Chapter 5. The Neighbor's Questions. By the following week, the county knew something was happening. In a community of the size and social density of the area around Hartwell, it was impossible for a widow to make a 40-mile ride without someone noting her direction and drawing inferences. Calls came. Neighbors arrived with dishes of food and expressions of solicitous concern that barely concealed their appetite for information. The most direct of these visits came from Franklin Cray, whose tobacco fields bordered Hartwell to the west and who had been James's closest friend and business associate for 20 years. He arrived on a Thursday, accepted a glass of bourbon, and told Caroline with the directness that she had always grudgingly respected in him that he knew about the house in Culpeper County. "Knew for how long?" Caroline asked. 10 years, give or take. She looked at him steadily. "And you said nothing to me." "It wasn't my place." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She set down her glass. "It was his. He chose not to." Franklin shifted in his chair. He was a large man, uncomfortable in parlors, more at ease in fields and barns. "Caroline, I'm going to be plain with you, because I think you appreciate plainness. What you're proposing to do with that codicil is going to cause you difficulties. The legal process for manumission in Virginia is—" "I've spoken to Mr. Vane about the legal process." "Then you know it requires court approval, and right now, with the political situation being what it is, you'll find judges who are not inclined to approve it. You'll find people who will say that honoring a codicil for the benefit of a colored woman and her child is an abolitionist statement. You'll find—" "Franklin." Her voice was quiet but sufficient. "I did not ask for your assessment of the difficulties. I asked how long you had known. You answered, 'We're finished with this subject.'" He left shortly after, and Caroline sat alone in the parlor and acknowledged, for perhaps the first time, the full weight of what she was undertaking. James had left her a clean house and a dirty conscience. He had written the codicil, had taken that much moral action, and had then died, leaving her to execute it in a climate that was growing less hospitable to such executions by the month. The country was fracturing. The debates in Congress that had seemed abstract and distant a few years ago were becoming urgent and proximate. Virginia was not a comfortable state in which to be freeing enslaved people in the autumn of 1858. It was, in fact, a state in which the decision to do so was becoming more dangerous with every passing season. She could have done nothing. The codicil was James's wish, not a legal requirement she was bound to fulfill. She could have sold the house in Culpeper County, settled Delia and Iris into the system as James's estate's assets, and been done with it. No one would have blamed her. Franklin Cray would have approved. Pemberton Vane would have sighed with relief. She thought about this for a full evening, sitting by the fire with a glass of bourbon that she did not drink, and then she thought about the gray eyes, James's eyes, her son William's eyes, the same eyes in 3 different people, 2 of whom knew about the third, and 1 of whom did not. Chapter 6. What William Had to Know. She told William on a Sunday evening. She chose Sunday because it was the day the household was most at rest, the day when unexpected information had the most space around it. She told him in the library, which was his father's room, and which he had been spending time in since James's death, sitting in his father's chair with his father's books, in the way of a young man trying to understand the shape of a man he had lost. She did not soften it. She gave him the facts in the order in which she had received them, with the same clarity she would have used to explain a business arrangement, because she had found, in her experience of difficult truths, that clarity was kinder than softness. Softness suggested the information needed to be cushioned. Clarity said, "You can bear this." William was 17 and had his father's gray eyes, and was, like his father, better at concealing feeling than at resolving it. He heard her out without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You've already decided to honor it," he said at last. "Yes." "You decided before you told me." "The decision was mine to make. The information was yours to have. Those are different things." He looked at the fire. His jaw was tight in the way James's had been when he was working through something he didn't want to be working through. "She's my sister," he said, as if saying it would make it more comprehensible. Yes, half-sister. Does she know about us? She knows her father had a family at Hartwell. She doesn't know your name. She's never been told. William was quiet again. Then, with the halting precision of someone thinking aloud, she's been 40 miles away her whole life. Yes. And father, he visited them? According to the correspondence, several times a year, on business trips to the south. The trips to Culpeper that he always said were about the Farley Mill contract. There is no Farley Mill contract. No. William stood and walked to the window. He was the same height as his father had been, and the gesture was his father's gesture, the turning to the window when something needed to be not faced directly. Caroline watched him do it and felt a complicated grief that was not precisely about James, and not precisely about William, and not precisely about any single thing she could name. "What do you need from me?" he asked. The question surprised her. She had expected argument or anger, or the kind of wounded silence that young men of his class and training used as a weapon. Instead, he had asked what she needed. "I need you to understand," she said. "What I do next may cost us socially. People will know. Franklin Cray already knows something is happening. When the manumission papers are filed, there will be no way to conceal why. The connection to your father will be clear." "Then it will be clear." He turned from the window. His expression was not what she had expected, not the expression of someone absorbing a blow, but the expression of someone who has found, unexpectedly, that they are able to stand. "He made a mess. We're cleaning it up. That's—" He paused. "That's what we do." She looked at her son for a moment and thought that he might be, in some ways she had not fully understood until this moment, considerably better than his father. Chapter 7. The Judge in Charlottesville. Pemberton Vane was right about the difficulties. The petition for manumission, filed with the Albemarle County Circuit Court in November 1858, was met with the particular species of bureaucratic obstruction that is used by men who cannot legally refuse a request but are determined to delay it indefinitely. The judge assigned to the case was a man named Halbert Greer, 60 years old, with the slow, deliberate manner of someone who had elevated the appearance of thoroughness into a method of paralysis. He required additional documentation, then additional witnesses, then a hearing that was scheduled and postponed twice for reasons that Pemberton Vane described with careful legal neutrality as procedural. Then another hearing at which Judge Greer expressed concerns about whether the codicil met the precise formal requirements of Virginia manumission law, concerns that Vane addressed with meticulous citations that the judge received with the polite attention of a man who had no intention of being persuaded. The months accumulated. Caroline managed the legal process with the same patient discipline she applied to everything else, but the delay had practical consequences. Delia and Iris remained in their Culpeper County house, technically still part of James Ashford's estate while the petition was pending, their legal status suspended in the particular limbo of a case that was going nowhere slowly. She visited them twice during the winter. The first visit was practical. She needed to ensure they had adequate provisions and that the house was secure. The second visit was less easy to categorize. She had found herself on a cold February morning with no particular errand to justify the 40-mile ride, simply going. Iris was there both times, observing Caroline with the careful assessment of someone who had learned that adults in positions of power over her were best understood thoroughly before being trusted. She answered questions with precision and asked questions in return with a directness that Caroline found, despite herself, impressive. The girl had read more than most grown men of Caroline's acquaintance. She had opinions that she stated clearly and defended with evidence. She had, Caroline thought on the second visit, the makings of someone remarkable, if the world would allow it. "Why does it take so long?" Iris asked on that February visit, sitting across the kitchen table from Caroline with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her gray eyes direct and unsentimental. "Because the judge doesn't want to approve it," Caroline said. She had found with Iris that directness was the only register the girl respected. He's not refusing, he's just not approving. What's the difference? Refusal can be appealed. Not approving just continues indefinitely. Iris considered this. So what do? We make it expensive for him to continue. Caroline set down her own cup. A judge who delays indefinitely attracts attention from people above him in the system. If we can make enough noise in the right places, make the delay itself a subject of interest, he becomes less comfortable with the alternative to simply ruling. "You've thought about this," Iris said. "I think about most things." A pause. Then Iris said with the careful precision of someone who had been thinking about something for a long time and was only now choosing to say it. "You didn't have to do this. Honor the codicil. You could have ignored it." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Caroline was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. It involved the roses on the fence, and William asking what she needed, and the gray eyes she could not stop seeing, and the particular kind of anger she felt toward James that was not separable from a determination not to perpetuate what he had done. It involved things she could not fully articulate even to herself. "Because he created you," she said finally. "And then he created a situation in which your existence was dependent on my goodwill. He had no right to put you in that position. The least I can do is not take advantage of it." Iris looked at her for a long moment. "That's not sentiment," she said. "That's principle." "I don't have much use for sentiment," Caroline agreed. Iris almost smiled. It was a careful, controlled thing, like a door opening a crack and then reconsidering. "My mother said you'd be like this." "Like what?" "Harder than you expected, but not hard in the way you feared." Caroline did not know what to do with that, so she finished her tea. Chapter 8. The Letter North. By March 1859, it was clear that Judge Greer was not going to be moved by legal procedure alone. Caroline spent a week in Charlottesville attending to the matter personally, meeting with Pemberton Vane daily, sitting in the gallery of the courthouse on 2 occasions to observe proceedings in other cases and make herself visible to Judge Greer in a way that was not threatening but was quite clearly patient. He was not a man who could be bullied. He was a man who could perhaps be worn down. But she was also doing something else, something she had not discussed with Pemberton Vane, who would have advised against it, and had not told William, who was managing Hartwell's spring planting in her absence. She was writing letters north. She had 3 connections in the northern states, a cousin in Philadelphia, a former school friend now living in Boston, and a business contact of James's in New York, who had, on a visit to Hartwell 2 years before, said something carefully vague over dinner that had suggested sympathies she had not, at the time, been in a position to respond to. She wrote to all 3. She described the situation with precision. She asked, in language that was unambiguous without being legally compromising, whether there were organizations or individuals who could provide support, financial, logistical, or political, for 2 women seeking to establish themselves in safety following the resolution of a legal matter in Virginia. She was not an abolitionist. She had not been and did not become one simply because a situation had made abolition a personal rather than an abstract matter. She was a practical woman dealing with a practical problem, and the practical problem was that freedom in Virginia in 1859 was not a sustainable condition for Delia and Iris, regardless of what any judge decided. The climate was too hostile. The laws were moving in the wrong direction. Even with papers, even with the full endorsement of the court, the 2 women would be vulnerable in a way that no document alone could address. They needed to leave. And leaving required resources and a destination and people who could help. The responses came within 6 weeks. Her cousin in Philadelphia connected her with a Quaker family who ran a small school for colored children and had experience assisting people in exactly this kind of situation. Her school friend in Boston provided the name and address of a minister who could be trusted. The New York contact wrote back in careful, oblique language that nonetheless made clear he had understood her letter precisely and was prepared to be useful. Caroline read these responses at her desk in the Charlottesville hotel and thought about James, who had written a codicil and then died, leaving his good intentions to be executed by someone else. She thought about the difference between having good intentions and acting on them, and about the fact that acting on them in this particular time and place required a willingness to operate outside the official systems that were designed to prevent exactly what she was trying to accomplish. She had spent her adult life operating within official systems. She had been, by every social measure, a respectable and conventional woman. She was becoming, she understood, something somewhat different. The understanding did not distress her as much as she might have expected. Chapter 9. What Iris Decided. The petition for manumission was approved in May 1859, after 6 months of obstruction, following a pointed letter from a Richmond attorney whom Caroline had engaged specifically because of his documented history of winning manumission cases through the application of precisely the kind of sustained procedural pressure that made judges like Halbert Greer eventually conclude that the path of least resistance was to rule. The papers were signed. Delia and Iris were free, in the legal sense, in Virginia, in May 1859. Caroline traveled to Culpeper County to deliver the documents herself and stood in the kitchen of the house with the roses on the fence and watched Iris read through every page with the same careful attention she applied to everything. When she finished, she looked up. "We can't stay here," she said. "No," Caroline agreed. "Not safely." "Where?" Caroline described what she had arranged: the Quaker family in Philadelphia, the school where Iris's education could continue at a level appropriate to her ability, the minister in Boston who could help Delia establish herself, the contacts who could be trusted. Iris listened without interrupting. When Caroline finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "You did all this without being asked." The codicil created a responsibility. I don't believe responsibility ends with the minimum legally required action. Iris looked at her steadily. The gray eyes in the May light were the color of water before a storm. "My brother," she said. "William, does he know?" "Yes." "Does he—" She stopped, started again. "What does he think?" Caroline considered how to answer this honestly. He was shocked. He was also— He asked what I needed. That was his first question. I don't know precisely what he thinks about you specifically because he hasn't met you. I know that he supported the decision to honor the codicil. I know that he is managing the work at Hartwell so that I can be here. She paused. He is better than his father. I believe that. I thought you should know. Something moved in Iris's expression that was not quite visible before it was controlled. She nodded once, a small, precise movement. Will I ever meet him? I don't know, Caroline said honestly. Not yet. Not while the country is as it is. But the country will not be as it is forever. Things this broken don't last. Iris thought about this for a moment. My mother says that too. She says nothing unjust can sustain itself indefinitely, that the weight of it eventually collapses the structure. Your mother is a wise woman. She is. A pause. Then, with the directness that Caroline had come to understand was simply Iris's natural register, did you hate him, my father? The question deserved a real answer. Caroline took a moment to find one. I was angry at him, she said. I was angry for a long time. I don't think I hated him. I think I understood him, which is worse in some ways. He was a man who was capable of genuine feeling and genuine cowardice in equal measure. He loved you in his way. The books, the piano, the codicil, those were love. But love exercised from a safe distance, without the willingness to pay its full cost, is a limited thing. It can do some good, but it can't do the good it's capable of. Iris was quiet. Then, "That's fair." "I try to be." "I know." The careful door opened again, slightly further than before. "It's the thing about you that's been hardest to adjust to." Chapter 10. The Morning of Departure. They left on a Tuesday morning at the end of May, which was, Caroline thought, exactly the kind of day such things happened on. The weather was clear and dry, good traveling weather. The roses on the fence were beginning their second bloom. Delia had accepted the arrangements with the measured gratitude of someone who had learned not to trust the permanence of anything good until it had actually happened, and who, now that it was actually happening, did not quite know how to be in a world where it had. She moved through the preparations for departure with the efficiency of someone who had spent 16 years maintaining readiness for exactly this kind of transition, packing only what was necessary, leaving the rest. Iris said goodbye to the house with a thoroughness that was not sentimental. She went from room to room with a deliberate attention, as if committing it to memory not out of affection, but out of discipline, making sure she had noted everything, missed nothing, left without illusions. She was taking the books, she was leaving the pencil drawing of James on the wall. Iris asked her about the drawing as they stood in the front room for the last time. "I don't want it," Iris said, "not as a picture on a wall. I have what he gave me that was worth having, his eyes, the books, whatever I am that came from him. The drawing is just paper." "Is there anything you want from me?" Caroline asked. The question was genuine, without qualification. Iris thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything. "I want you to tell William that I am—" She paused, choosing words with care. "Tell him that I am aware of what he has by virtue of his birth that I don't have by virtue of mine, and that I'm not angry about it. The arrangements of the world are not his fault. But tell him I expect him to use what he has well. Tell him that from me." "I'll tell him. I'll tell him." "And," another pause, longer, "tell him that if the world ever gets to a place where it's possible, I would like to know him. I have never had a brother. I think it might be—" She stopped. The gray eyes were entirely controlled, but Caroline had learned, in the months of this strange acquaintance, to read what was controlled in them as well as what was visible. "I think it might be worth something." "I'll tell him that too." The carriage took them north through the Virginia spring, and Caroline stood at the gate with the roses until it was gone. Epilogue. What Caroline kept. The social consequences were what Franklin Cray had predicted, and considerably less severe than he had implied. There were neighbors who withdrew. There was talk, for a season, of the kind that attaches to women who act outside expected patterns. Pemberton Ain received 2 separate inquiries from men in the county asking, in the carefully coded language of men who wanted to know if Hartwell was coming up for sale, whether Mrs. Ashford was finding the management of the estate difficult. She found it no more difficult than it had always been. William managed the spring planting with competence she had not fully anticipated, and then the summer harvest, and then the autumn preparations. He was, as she had told Iris, better than his father, not because he was free of his father's weaknesses, because he was not, but because he was aware of them in a way that James had never managed to be. He knew his own capacity for comfortable self-deception, and the knowledge made him imperfectly, but genuinely, careful. She wrote to Iris every month. The letters went north through a route that was indirect for reasons of safety, and arrived, based on Iris's responses, with reasonable reliability. Iris's letters back were precise, informative, and occasionally in ways that suggested she was permitting herself to practice something she was not fully comfortable with, almost warm. She was attending the Quaker school. She was advancing rapidly through levels designed for students considerably older than herself. She had opinions about her teachers that she shared with characteristic directness. She was, by every indication, exactly what she had always threatened to be. Delia had settled in Boston, near the minister whose congregation provided something she had not had since James's death, a community that knew her full history and received her into its life without requiring her to be less than she was. She wrote to Caroline once, a single letter of 2 pages, formal in its expression and precise in its content, saying what needed to be said and no more. She thanked Caroline for the practical assistance. She said nothing about James, which was its own kind of eloquence. She said that Iris was flourishing. Caroline kept both letters in the top drawer of her desk, with the codicil and the folded note she had found among James's papers, a note she had never shown to anyone, found between the pages of the financial ledger, written in James's hand and apparently never sent. "I should have done this sooner. I knew it while I was doing it, and I did it anyway. There is no excuse for that." No excuse, just a small, clear acknowledgement, written perhaps late at night in the silence of the study, in the handwriting she had known for 19 years, the closest he had ever come to an accounting. She kept it because it was true, and because truth, however belated, is not nothing. The war came in 1861, as everyone had seen it coming, and Virginia went with the Confederacy, and the world remade itself in the direction of consequence. Hartwell survived, damaged but standing. William survived, coming back from 2 years of service with a wound in his shoulder and a gravity in his face that had not been there before. The slaves at Hartwell were freed by the terms of the 13th Amendment in 1865, and some left and some stayed, and Caroline paid wages to those who stayed and gave letters of character to those who went, and tried to do it with the same principle she had tried to apply to everything since the Tuesday the lawyer arrived with the sealed envelope. In 1866, a letter came from Philadelphia. Iris was 23. She was teaching at a school for freed people in the city, doing the work that had found her as naturally as a river finds its level. She was engaged to be married to a man she described in 3 careful sentences, each one saying more than it appeared to. She was writing because she had heard through the network that had helped her travel north 7 years before that the war was over, and that Virginia was reconstructing itself, and that perhaps the arrangements of the world were beginning, however slowly and imperfectly, to change. She was writing to ask if the offer she had made at the gate in Culpeper County on a May morning 7 years ago still held, whether it might be possible now to know her brother. Caroline read the letter twice. Then she put it in the top drawer with the others, went to find William in the fields where he was overseeing the first real tobacco harvest since the war, and handed it to him without comment. He read it standing in the October light among the brown stalks of the harvest. She watched his face as he read, the gray eyes moving across the page, the jaw tightening and then releasing, the expression of a man encountering something that was both entirely unexpected and somehow entirely right. When he finished, he looked up at her. "Yes," he said. "Obviously, yes." She nodded. She had known he would say that. She walked back to the house and began to compose a reply.